What would you say if you learned that 12 super academics, including seminary and Bible college professors, most with Doctor of Ministry or PhD degrees, and pastors and chaplains, some with more than 50 years of ministry experience, went into a room and came out 3 hours later, changed in what they believed about the end times? Some had completely changed from the way they went in, and almost all were at least open to considering that their long-held beliefs about the end times needed to be reconsidered, especially the part about whether or not the end times have already begun. And to you, this may sound almost miraculous. Hey, my church needs to go into that room, you might be saying. You see, just a year ago, this channel did a survey of the people who watch our channel. 75% of you said your church and other churches that you know are asleep in regard to the end times. And shockingly, a third of you say you no longer attend church at all because the pastors are just snoozing and not really aware of what's going on. That's what makes what happened this last June seems so miraculous. This isn't some kind of fantasy. This is real life, and it happened to Dr. Steve Taylor, a brand new friend of mine who I think is going to become a real good friend of mine. A wonderful guy that you're going to hear from today and hear the story of how this really happened during his doctoral dissertation. You know, where they have these stuffy committees that have to hear your dissertation. He changed them. He changed their opinion about what was going on spiritually in this world. And he did it in 3 short hours. This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters. So let me give you a quick introduction of who this is. His name is Dr. Steve Taylor. He got his doctorate in ministry this June when he had this amazing interaction with his doctoral committee. Number 2, he's a lawyer. He's working with, Alliance Defending Freedom and Christian Rights Ministries and things like that, defending ministries like us or individuals like you when the government is coming down on them. And then he's also a pastor of Trinity Christian Church of Suffolk in Suffolk, Virginia. You're going to love this guy. Let's get right into the video.
Hi, Dr. Steve. We are so glad you're on our channel today. It is not every day that I get to talk to someone who has a doctorate of ministry. We have a lot of scholars come on, but very few with doctorates. So we are very thrilled to have you on. And when I had a chance to read your dissertation, so look at that, guys. Even bigger maybe than Revelation Deciphered, so one of our books. So it is quite an impressive dissertation, and someone who defended their dissertation in front of a bunch of scholars who were also quite interested in what you had to say. And you're even writing a book on the 10 virgins, one of my favorite subjects, a book called The Midnight Christ. So we're going to talk about all those things today. Why don't we get started? Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you decided to do this?
Well, Nelson, that one of the big reasons that I decided to do this was that, like you, that I believe that we could have entered the last 7 years of this age, what many people call the tribulation. And, just wanted to share with the public the evidence that leads, both of us to that conclusion. We have these global events and geopolitical developments. A lot of things seem to be aligning with the prophecies that are really coming together at an unprecedented rate.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I've really become concerned that many Christians, churchgoers, are really unaware of the current prophetic events and the times that are in. You took a poll last year, and the indication from that poll was that most Christians and Christian church leaders have a general lack of understanding or even really an interest in end-time prophecy. A lot of the churchgoers have that interest, but they're just not hearing it in their pulpits.
Okay, so Dr. Steve, I'm really interested in your dissertation also. What was the purpose of your dissertation? What were the main points that you were trying to get at in that dissertation?
Well, it's an interesting question, Nelson, that, I started out with the purpose of laying out the possibility that Mystery Babylon was not necessarily the UN, but very similar to what this channel presents, a elites controlling the UN, or even more importantly, spiritual forces controlling the elites that are controlling the UN. During that process of trying to prove that in the presentation, the whole dissertation took a different turn, because all of a sudden I recognized that none of these guys knew anything about what I was talking about. Because once I started presenting the Mystery Babylon, the Neon, things of that nature, Great Reset, I recognized these guys didn't have a clue what I was talking about. And so that became the focus of, can the church wake up? Can the leaders wake up if you present a very well presented 2 or 3 hour presentation to them with PowerPoints and things of that nature? Can these guys wake up? And so the findings of the presentation changed from trying to prove Mystery Babylon to see whether or not Jesus' statement in Matthew 25, 1 through 13 was true, which was much easier to prove. We have a pretty good idea that Jesus is going to be correct. So I changed the whole focus in the last 6 months to, rather than proving Mystery Babylon by using your and Joel Richardson's evidences, came a presentation to determine whether or not, if presented with relevant facts that we could be in the dissertation, would that wake anybody up? And then could I prove that Jesus would be correct that the entire church was asleep? And the findings were that, one, they were asleep, and that, two, they could wake up if they were presented. And so that gave encouragement as far as the overall finding. That's really what happened.
Well, that was great. And I think that's encouraging because, when you read that the church is asleep, all 10, and that they only wake up at the midnight cry, it makes you think sometimes that maybe that's the abomination of desolation and nobody wakes up till then. But that's not what you found. What you found is if you present facts that people can wake up, I think that's a very, very significant thought.
So, my understanding is that you reasoned that if the last days were near, church leaders would be asleep just like most other people, but they might awaken if they heard the quote midnight cry of Matthew 25:6. And your dissertation was kind of a test of sorts to see if they would awaken if they were shown emerging specific current events that aligned with, the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And the other thing that you indicated, to me at least, was that you gave them ample opportunity to ask questions and get those questions answered. And that ultimately your whole purpose was finding a way to awaken church leaders so they in turn could awaken the church. And we need to give a shout out to Dr. Steve's mentor, Dr. Charlie Stover, who allowed that to happen and saw the advantage and the meaning of this incredible exercise. Now, let's get back to the interview.
So in addition, you made a note to me that one of the things you found from this dissertation was increased teaching about end times and increased preaching about end times was extremely significant right now. So do you want to go into that a little bit about why you feel that way?
Well, sure. So, the presentation that we gave to these leaders, that most of the pastors and even the academic professionals admitted to spending little time on prophetic topics. That's despite the fact that we're potentially in the end times, the last 7 years, even now. Many of them said they spoke less than 10% of their teaching time, the academics, and less than 5% in some cases, as far as their pastoral time, teaching and preaching on subjects related to last day prophecies.
And by the way, if I can interrupt, 5% is probably a large number compared to, the average church in America, which spends, close to zero time speaking about prophetic events. But go ahead, continue.
Well, most folks that we had in the presentation, again, these are individuals with significant either academic or pastoral experience. That most of them didn't know where Neom even was, or how it might apply to end time prophecy. Very few, I think one out of the 12 that we had in the presentation understood the possibility that Mystery Babylon might be a one world government sort of entity, or a one world government led entity.
And another thing that I picked up from his dissertation was that none of them knew that there would be two one world governments in the final 7 years, not just one. But after the presentation, 8 of the 12 came to that conclusion.
And so there's a lot of things going on right now that they just weren't aware of, they weren't dialed into. Very, very great, very, very educated, very, very knowledgeable individuals, but that they weren't aware of current events as they aligned to biblical prophecy. But the really encouraging thing was, is as we showed how current events, geopolitical circumstance aligned with biblical prophecy, they had wake up moments, and that they recognized that things were coming together much more quickly than they had understood previously. I thought it was super, super powerful in the presentation. You know, when we did the presentation, one of the pastors there saw the UN globe wrapped with the Stephanos wreath, and after it was explained to them that, and him, that what that could possibly represent is a global government that was using peace and in order to conquer, and he saw that globe with that Stephanos wreath around it, he said that that changed his perspective on everything. He said, once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. It was a midnight cry for that person.
Isn't that amazing? Hallelujah. I'm extremely happy about that. That makes me feel absolutely great, because you're right. Sometimes it's just putting two things together and you suddenly say, oh my, that's the white horseman. Yeah, that's amazing. That is absolutely amazing.
So the idea began to run through my head, and I bet it's running through your head as well. How can we duplicate this process? How can we reach out to pastors and academics and even people who are just regular old pew sitters to get them to see that light bulb moment? We thought about this. Here's what we came up with. There were 2 factors that made this work. One, these guys were a captured audience. They had to sit there for 2 hours and listen to Dr. Steve. And number 2 is he had a great presentation that just overwhelmed them. If we're able to duplicate those 2 things, a captive audience and having a great presentation, we may actually be able to make headway, even against your pastor and in your church, or in your neighborhood with a group of your friends. But first, let's get back to Dr. Pastor Steve, because I'm sure you want to hear what he has to say, not just what I have to say. And at this point in the conversation, he and I started talking about the midnight cry that's part of the parable of the 10 virgins, and a huge mistake that people make, thinking that this is the cry what Jesus makes when he descends from heaven and he's coming back at the second coming.
I did a little bit deeper dive on the cry, that the linguistics behind the cry. And I think I was actually watching the Midnight Cry. I can't remember the guy that did it as far as the song.
The song, yeah,
yeah. But quite clearly that most folks think in solid Christian folks that love Jesus, think the Midnight Cry is that cry that you hear in Thessalonians of him returning, versus the cry, and again on the cross cry that Jesus had. It's the clamor cry. It's the
Yes.
worry cry. It's the cry that basically says that when they hear that cry, there's going to not be a cry of joy or excitement, or they're going to say, my goodness, I messed up. I completely missed what I was supposed to know. And they get it in that very moment, but they recognize that it's trouble. It's problematic. It's not good. That they realized that they've been asleep and they had just waken up, and everything around them that should have told them that they should have been awake, they're just now realizing that they missed it. That's the cry. It's definitely not the cry of victory that you hear in Thessalonians. Kroge is the cry that is associated with 25:6, and that the First Thessalonians 4:16 is, I think it's Kaliuma,
Okay.
which is the military style command that you hear.
Yes, it's a military cry, right?
Right. It's it's the victory. It's the cry that precedes Jesus returning to earth. That's the cry that is associated with that song, Midnight Cry. That Jesus cries and everybody's so happy that Jesus is coming. But that's not what's happening. The cry that is in 25:6 is, you mentioned, it's the same as the Jesus cry on the cross, which is a derivative of that word. It's the cry of clamor, the cry of turmoil, the cry of being caught off guard. That's the cry that you hear when that Kroge cry. It's the cry of anguish, of tumult, that kind of thing. And so that's, I think, important, because that when people hear that midnight cry, I think that the midnight point that you hit on in one of your videos is really, really good too, because it's about the midst. It's about the very middle of something.
It is midnight after all.
We don't know whether or not it's the middle of the 7-year period of time, or whether it's at nighttime, or what it is. But I think that it's very likely the midpoint, whether it's the abomination of desolation, whether it's the the Antichrist in the temple, something happening directly in the middle of the 7-year period of time, or as that we think might be the case, the thought that I think that you've recently either put on your channel or are going to put on your channel about the two witnesses.
Right. They could be the actual voice.
Because the words of Matthew 25:6 say, "Behold, the bridegroom go out to meet him." Those are actual words. Words have to be spoken by a voice. And who would have the credibility to say those words and have everyone in the church believe them? Why, possibly the prophet Elijah, who could be one of the two witnesses. We know he returns in the end times. And we also know that the parable of the 10 virgins is a story about a Jewish wedding from the first century. And it was the honor of the best man at that wedding to come and announce that the bridegroom was on his way to the bride's house. Who was given that honor in the first century but John the Baptist, who came in the spirit of Elijah? Will Elijah be the best man for the wedding that is coming? Well, that's a very strong possibility in our minds. So let's continue thinking about this midnight cry.
It's going to be different things for different people. It might be a culmination of a lot of things. That's how it works with a lot of folks, is that, it takes, repeated. It's like when Jesus talks to us. We hear Jesus 10 times before we recognize that he was talking to us 9 times before that. You know what I'm saying?
A good example of that is this exact parable.
Mm-hmm.
All right. How long have you and I looked at this parable through our Christian lives? I came to Christ in 1991. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a fairly long time. And, I didn't realize this about the parable of the 10 virgins, that the virgins were all asleep and that was significant. I didn't realize that until, maybe 10 years ago. So, for 23 years, I was asleep. And, so there's always that element that all of us are slowly and gradually moving toward the truth, but not really grasping everything Jesus had to say.
So this brings me to what we're going to do. What we're going to do for you and with you. Do you remember me talking about making a set of flash drives that would have videos on them from the Nelson channel, so that when things are censored, you would still sort of have the Nelson channel, but at your house? Well, I think the very first one of these we have to do is a teaching video, not for you, but for people that you're in contact with, your pastor, the elders of your church, maybe your neighbors, maybe your small group, that can be presented to them when they're a captive audience, which means you have to really be there. Because, and you know what happens? Somebody's starting to hear something they don't like to hear, they just turn it off, they don't listen to it. But if you're there with them, like Dr. Steve was with the group of 12 who heard his dissertation, they had to listen. If you're there with them, they have to listen to the whole teaching. And I think what happens is, as you go through it, they may not agree at the very beginning, but by listening to the whole thing, they begin to pick it up. Maybe something that's about a half an hour long. So I think Dr. Steve and I will work together on this and begin to put something together that you can use in your real life to make real difference in the people around you and maybe in your church. Now, I bet in this video you heard Dr. Steve talk about a recent video that our channel did on the 10 virgins called Sleeping Through the Apocalypse. If you haven't seen that video yet, it talks about how everyone in the Christian church is asleep right now, sleeping through the beginning of the apocalypse. It's according to Jesus' teaching in the parable of the 10 virgins. If you want to see that, well, click right here to keep watching. This is the same teaching that turned around the thinking of the academics, taking 12 guys who were unaware of what was going on in the world and turning him into someone who now understood. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.